A chance act of kindness leads to a life-altering revelation when a millionaire discovers the woman he assisted shares an unexpected connection with him. Their intertwined paths unfold in ways neither could have imagined. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The gleaming windows of the Morrison building reflected the morning sun as Robert Matthews strode through the revolving doors, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. The security guard nodded respectfully. They all knew who he was. Robert Matthews, CEO of Matthews Investment Group, the man who turned millions into billions with a few keystrokes. In his corner office on the 47th floor, Robert settled into his ergonomic chair, surrounded by screens displaying stock tickers and investment portfolios. His assistant had already placed his morning coffee, black, no sugar, on his desk, along with a stack of reports requiring his attention. He barely noticed the protesters gathering on the street below, their signs blurring into meaningless shapes from his vantage point. Another day, another dollar, he muttered, pulling up the latest investment projections. The numbers were good. They always were. Robert had built his reputation on being 3 steps ahead of the market. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, a habit he developed over years of high-stakes meetings, as he reviewed the charts showing steady upward trajectories. The phone rang, interrupting his concentration. "Mr. Matthews, it's James Porter from Global Tech," his assistant announced through the intercom. "Put him through." Robert's voice remained neutral, but his pulse quickened. This was the call he'd been waiting for, a potential investment that could revolutionize the tech industry. "Robert, have you reviewed the proposal?" James's voice crackled with excitement. "I have. The numbers look promising, but I have concerns about the social impact assessment." Robert paused, remembering his board's insistence on considering ESG factors. Not that he particularly cared, money was money, but appearances mattered. As he ended the call, shouting from below grew louder. Robert glanced out his window. The protesters had multiplied, their signs now clearly visible. "Corporate greed kills communities," in Matthews Group. Blood money. Leaving the office later that evening, Robert encountered them face to face. A young woman with a megaphone stepped in front of him. "Mr. Matthews, how do you justify investing in companies that destroy low-income neighborhoods?" Robert adjusted his tie, keeping his expression neutral. His security team moved to intervene, but he held up his hand. "No comment," he said simply, walking past them toward his waiting car. The encounter left him unsettled, though he'd never admit it. He decided to walk the last few blocks, dismissing his driver. The city felt different at street level, grittier, more real. That's when he saw her. She sat on a piece of cardboard, her clothes worn but clean, a small sign propped against a cup. "Any help appreciated." "God bless." Something about her made Robert pause. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in her posture, or the way she kept her head high despite her circumstances. Their eyes met briefly. Robert usually avoided such encounters. His assistant handled all his charitable giving through proper channels. But something felt different this time. He found himself reaching for his wallet. "When was your last meal?" he heard himself asking. The woman, Jasmine, though he didn't know her name yet, looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Yesterday morning," she answered honestly. Robert gestured to the diner across the street. "Would you like something to eat?" She hesitated, studying him with wary eyes. Robert was used to people being cautious around him, but usually because of his wealth and power. This wariness felt different, more mundane. Tal, born of hard experience. "No strings attached," he added, maintaining a professional distance. "Just food." After a long moment, she nodded, gathering her few belongings with careful movements. As they crossed the street together, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, though he had no way of knowing just how much this encounter would change his life. Inside Pete's diner, fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the worn leather booths. Jasmine sat stiffly, her backpack clutched close to her body, eyes darting between Robert and the exit. The waitress approached, her name tag slightly crooked, eyebrows raised at the unlikely pair. "Order whatever you'd like," Robert said, noticing how Jasmine studied the prices before the items. He kept his phone face down on the table, fighting his usual urge to check the markets. "Just coffee and toast, please," Jasmine said quietly. "She'll have the full breakfast special," Robert corrected. "And I'll take a coffee." The waitress nodded, disappearing behind the counter. Silence stretched between them. Robert noticed details he typically overlooked. The way other customers avoided looking at Jasmine, how the manager kept glancing their way with barely concealed suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" Jasmine finally asked, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. Robert considered the question. In his world, every action had a clear purpose, a definable return on investment. This? He wasn't sure. "Everyone deserves to eat," he said simply. The food arrived, steam rising from the heap of eggs, bacon, and pancakes. Jasmine ate slowly, methodically, as if savoring each bite while making it last. Robert found himself studying her hands. They were weathered but graceful, with calluses that spoke of hard work. When he offered her money afterward, she accepted it with dignified reluctance. "Thank you," she said, and something in her tone suggested she meant more than just the meal and money. Later that night, in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Robert couldn't shake thoughts of Jasmine. The contrast between their lives felt stark in a way that made him uncomfortable. His housekeeper had left dinner, some elaborate French dish he barely tasted. He wandered to his home office, the city lights twinkling below. His laptop displayed the usual evening reports, but instead, he found himself Googling statistics about homelessness in New York. The numbers were staggering, yet they never seemed real until today. His phone buzzed. Another investment opportunity, another million to be made. Robert stared at the message, thinking about how that same amount could change someone like Jasmine's life completely. The evening took an unexpected turn when he checked his personal email. Among the usual business correspondence and social invitations, one subject line stood out. "Family archives, you need to see this." Robert nearly deleted it, assuming spam, but something made him pause. The sender's address appeared legitimate, though unfamiliar. When he opened it, his breath caught. The photo was old, its colors faded to sepia tones. Two children sat on a porch swing, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The boy was clearly himself, his characteristic serious expression already present. But it was the girl that made his hands shake. Despite the image's age, despite the decades that had passed, he recognized those eyes. They were the same ones that had looked at him across a diner table just hours ago. "Impossible," he muttered, but he was already pulling up his family's private records on his secure server. His childhood memories were fragmented. He'd always attributed that to his parents' messy divorce. But now, examining old documents with new eyes, he noticed gaps, inconsistencies. A photo album from his childhood jumped from age 6 to age 8, with no explanation. Court records mentioned trauma and therapy, but provided no details. And his mother's letters from that period were full of cryptic references to protecting what remains. Robert sat back, his mind racing. The woman on the street. Jasmine? Could it really be? But if she was who this suggested, why hadn't she said anything? Did she even know? His phone buzzed again, but this time he ignored it. Instead, he pulled up a search for private investigators, then stopped. Something told him that throwing money at this situation, as he did with most problems, wasn't the right approach. He needed to talk to Jasmine again, but he had no way to contact her. Would she even be in the same spot tomorrow? The uncertainty was foreign to him. In his world, everything and everyone was just a phone call away. For the first time in years, Robert Matthews, master of the financial universe, felt completely out of his depth. As he stared at the old photograph, questions multiplied in his mind, each one leading to another, more disturbing possibility. Robert barely slept that night, the old photograph haunting his thoughts. Morning found him in his private car, circling the blocks where he'd met Jasmine. His driver, Thompson, knew better than to ask questions about this unusual deviation from their normal route to the office. At his desk, Robert canceled his morning meetings, something he hadn't done in years. Instead, he called Marcus Sullivan, his family's longtime lawyer who'd handled his parents' divorce. "Marcus, I need information about something that happened when I was around 7, Robert said, cutting through the usual pleasantries. "There was an incident, something involving another child." A long silence followed. When Marcus spoke, his voice carried an edge of caution. "Robert, those records were sealed by court order. I'm not asking about records, Marcus. I'm asking you, as someone who was there, what happened to my sister?" Another pause. "You remember her?" "Not really, but I found a photo, and I think I may have found her." Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Listen carefully, Robert. Your sister's disappearance wasn't just a family tragedy. There were complications. People involved who I need to know, Marcus." The lawyer sighed. "She was taken during the custody battle. Your father blamed your mother. Your mother blamed your father. The police investigation went nowhere. After a year, the case went cold. Your parents agreed never to discuss it. They thought it would be easier for you to forget." Robert's grip tightened on his phone. "Her name. What was her name?" "Jasmine. Jasmine Matthews." The confirmation hit Robert like a physical blow. He thanked Marcus and ended the call, his mind racing. The girl in his fragmented memories, playing in a backyard, sharing ice cream, crying when he pulled her hair, had been real. That afternoon, he returned to where he'd met Jasmine. She was there in nearly the same spot, but this time reading a worn paperback. As he approached, he noticed details he'd missed before. The shape of her nose, the set of her jaw, features that mirrored his own. "I brought you something," he said, holding out the photograph. Jasmine looked up, surprised to see him again. When her eyes fell on the photo, her expression changed. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "It was emailed to me yesterday. That's me in the photo. And I think the girl is you." Jasmine stared at the image for a long time. "I have dreams sometimes," she finally said. "About a house with a red door. A boy who used to chase me around the yard. But I always thought they were just dreams." "What's your earliest clear memory?" Robert asked, sitting down on a nearby bench. "Foster care, age 8. Before that, everything's fuzzy. The social workers said I was found wandering alone in Queens. No ID, no family they could locate. I could only remember my first name. Robert F. Held his chest tightened. Jasmine Matthews." Her head snapped up. "Just Jasmine. They gave me the last name Brown at the foster home." "I think you're my sister," Robert said quietly. "I think you were taken during our parents' divorce. I've been talking to people, looking into records." "Stop," Jasmine interrupted, her voice sharp. "Do you know what it's like to grow up not knowing who you are? To have people make up stories about where you came from? I can't let myself believe this just because some rich man shows up with an old photo." "Then let me prove it," Robert insisted. "We could do DNA tests. I have resources, connections. And what if you're right?" Jasmine challenged. "What then? We just become one big happy family? You go back to your penthouse, and I go back to my cardboard box, but now with a famous last name?" The bitterness in her voice made Robert flinch. "I want to help. I don't need your help. I need..." She stopped, gathering her thoughts. "I need time to think about this, to process it." Robert nodded slowly. "Will you meet me again? Tomorrow? We can talk more, or not talk at all. Whatever you want." Jasmine carefully handed back the photograph. "Same time, same place," she said after a long moment. "But I'm not promising anything." As Robert walked away, his mind was already forming plans. DNA tests, private investigators, legal teams. But something told him that solving this mystery would require more than just throwing money at it. For the first time in his adult life, Robert Matthews would have to learn patience. Sunrise Valley Care Home stood in stark contrast to Robert's usual surroundings. The beige walls and antiseptic smell reminded him why he'd avoided visiting for months. His mother, Eleanor Matthews, once a formidable socialite, now occupied a private room filled with fading photographs and wilting flowers. "Bobby," Eleanor's voice wavered as he entered. She sat in her wheelchair by the window, her once perfect posture now slightly stooped. "You never come on Thursdays. I need to ask you something, Mom." Robert pulled up a chair, noticing how his mother's hands trembled as she adjusted her shawl. "About Jasmine." The change was immediate. Eleanor's face went blank, her hands gripping the armrests. "I don't know anyone by that name." "Mom, please. I found her. Impossible." Eleanor's voice turned sharp. She's gone. We agreed never to. She's alive. Living on the streets of New York. I've spoken to her. Eleanor's breathing became rapid. A nurse passing by glanced in with concern, but Robert waved her away. You don't understand, Eleanor whispered. They said they would kill her if we looked for her. They said they would kill you both. Who said that? Who took her? But Eleanor had retreated into herself, mumbling about red doors and broken promises. Robert recognized the signs. She was slipping into one of her episodes. The nurse returned, suggesting he leave. Meanwhile, across town, Jasmine huddled in her usual spot, trying to stay warm as autumn winds whipped through the streets. A group of teenagers passed by, one of them spitting near her feet. Get a job, trash, one called out. Jasmine pulled her coat tighter, remembering the photograph Robert had shown her. Could she really be the same person as that smiling little girl? The thought seemed absurd, yet something about it rang true in a way she couldn't explain. A police officer approached, twirling his baton. Move along, he ordered. Business owners are complaining. I have a right to be here, Jasmine replied, her voice steady despite her fear. Rights? The officer laughed. Listen, lady, is there a problem here? Robert's voice cut through the tension. He'd returned from visiting his mother just in time. The officer's demeanor changed instantly upon recognizing Robert. Mr. Matthews, sir. No problem at all. Just keeping the streets clear. This woman is with me, Robert stated firmly. The officer retreated with, Acha mumble d'apologie. Jasmine stood, brushing off her clothes. I didn't need your help. I know. Robert hesitated. Listen, I just spoke with my mother. She remembers you. Something happened back then, something that scared her badly. Jasmine's expression softened slightly. Is she okay? She's in a care facility. Early onset dementia, among other things. Robert ran a hand through his hair. Look, I have a spare room in my apartment. It's yours if you want it. Why would you offer that to a stranger? Because you're not a stranger. You're my sister. And even if you weren't, he gestured at the darkening sky, the dropping temperature. No one should have to live like this. Jasmine studied him for a long moment. If I say yes, there are no strings attached? I can leave whenever I want? Absolutely. And you won't try to fix me? Make me into something I'm not. I just want to help and maybe understand what happened to us. Thunder rumbled overhead as the first raindrops fell. Jasmine looked at her few possessions, then back at Robert. One night, she said finally. I'll stay one night. As they walked to his car, Robert noticed how Jasmine held herself, proud despite her circumstances, resilient despite her fears. She reminded him of their mother in her better days, though he kept that observation to himself. In the car, Jasmine clutched her worn backpack like a shield. Your mother, she said quietly. What did she say about me? Not much that made sense, but she was scared, terrified actually. She mentioned threats, people who said they would hurt us if anyone went looking. Jasmine absorbed this information silently. After a moment, she asked, The house we lived in, did it have a red door? Yes, Robert replied, surprised. How did you? Dreams, Jasmine said simply. Just dreams. As they drove through the rain-slicked streets toward Robert's penthouse, neither spoke. Both were lost in thoughts of red doors, broken families, and the long-buried secrets they were about to uncover. Robert's penthouse felt like a museum to Jasmine, all chrome, glass, and pristine surfaces. She stood in the doorway of the guest room, larger than any apartment she'd ever had, clutching her backpack like a life preserver. The bathroom's through there, Robert gestured, trying to sound casual. There are fresh towels, and I had my assistant drop off some basics. He nodded toward the shopping bags on the bed, filled with new clothes. I can't accept all this, Jasmine said, but her eyes lingered on the bags. Think of it as a loan, if that makes it easier. After Jasmine showered and changed, Robert ordered dinner. They sat at his massive dining table, the city lights twinkling beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. He noticed how she used her silverware with perfect manners, despite years on the street. Where did you learn to eat like that? He asked. Foster home number 3. Mrs. Peterson insisted on proper etiquette, said it would help us rise above our circumstances. Jasmine's laugh held no humor. Funny how knowing which fork to use doesn't actually help when you're sleeping under a bridge. The next morning, Robert found Jasmine already awake, staring at his wall of family photos. "There are none of you," she observed. "Mom destroyed them all after you disappeared. Said she couldn't bear to look at them." Throughout the day, Robert worked from home, watching as Jasmine explored the apartment like a cautious cat. She spent hours in his library, running her fingers along book spines, occasionally pulling one out to read. During a video call, one of Robert's board members noticed Jasmine in the background. "Who's the girl?" he asked, his tone suggesting disapproval. "Family," Robert replied firmly, ending the call. That evening, he found Jasmine sketching in a notebook she'd brought with her. The drawings were raw, powerful, scenes of street life rendered with unflinching honesty. "These are incredible," he said. Jasmine quickly closed the notebook. "It's nothing, just something I do to pass time. Have you ever had training?" "Some. There was an art program at the community center before they lost funding." She paused. Art was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did. When you're homeless, people look right through you. Drawing was my way of saying I see you to others like me. Robert's phone buzzed. Another board member asking about the homeless woman seen in his apartment. He ignored it. "They won't accept this easily," Jasmine said, nodding toward his phone. "Your world isn't made for people like me." "Then maybe it's time for my world to change." Later that night, Robert heard muffled crying from Jasmine's room. He stood outside her door, hand raised to knock, but stopped himself. Some wounds couldn't be fixed with money or good intentions. The next morning, he invited several influential friends for dinner, hoping to introduce Jasmine to his social circle. The evening was a disaster. His friends, despite their liberal politics and charitable donations, couldn't hide their discomfort. One woman clutched her purse tighter whenever Jasmine passed by. Another made pointed comments about pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. Jasmine endured it all with quiet dignity until one guest asked, "So, what's it really like being homeless?" "I've always wondered." The room fell silent. Jasmine set down her fork, looked the woman in the eye, and said, "It's like being invisible and having a spotlight on you at the same time. It's watching people cross the street to avoid you while wearing shoes that cost more than 6 months of food stamps. It's being told to get a job by people who wouldn't hire you because you don't have an address to put on the application." She stood up. "Thank you for dinner, Robert, but I think I should go." "Jasmine, wait." "No," she said firmly. "This was a mistake. You can't just insert me into your life and expect everything to work out. Your world sees me as a charity case at best, a threat at worst. And I won't be either." After she left, Robert confronted his guests' thinly veiled racism and classism. One by one, they made excuses and left. Only his oldest friend, Sarah, remained. "You're really convinced she's your sister?" Sarah asked. "I am." "Then forget about everyone else. Help her on her terms, not yours." Robert spent the night unable to sleep, remembering the determination in Jasmine's voice when she spoke about her art. An idea began to form. Not another handout, but perhaps a hand up on her own terms. The next morning, he found her in her usual spot on the street. Without preamble, he said, "I'm sorry about last night. I was wrong to try to force you into my world. But I have a proposition for you, no strings attached." Jasmine looked up warily. "I'm listening." "I want to sponsor an art exhibition," Robert said, standing on the sidewalk. "Your art, your vision, your truth. No interference from me." But Jasmine was already shaking her head. "I can't go back there, Robert. Those people, their judgment, their assumptions, not for them. For people like you. In a community center, not some fancy gallery. Your art, your audience, your rules." She remained silent, fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. Finally, she spoke. "I need time, space to think. All of this," she gestured vaguely, encompassing Robert, his world, their newfound connection. "It's too much." "I understand," Robert said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "The apartment is still yours whenever you want it." Jasmine gathered her few belongings. "Thank you for everything, but I need to do this my way." As he watched her walk away, Robert felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. His phone buzzed with messages from last night's dinner guests. Apologies, explanations, justifications. He deleted them all. In his office later that day, Robert found himself unable to focus on market reports and investment strategies. Instead, he pulled up articles about systemic racism, about generational poverty, about the invisible barriers that kept people like Jasmine on the streets despite their talents and determination. "Sir," his assistant interrupted, "the board is waiting for your quarterly presentation." Robert stood, straightened his tie, and walked into the boardroom. But instead of his usual market analysis, he found himself talking about community investment, about social responsibility, about using their wealth to affect real change. "This isn't what we do," one board member objected. "Then maybe it's time we changed what we do," Robert replied, thinking of Jasmine's unflinching artwork. Meanwhile, Jasmine had found refuge in a women's shelter she knew well. In the common room, she pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw, not the usual street scenes, but memories. A red door, a boy's laughing face, a woman's hands arranging flowers. "Those are beautiful," said Maria, one of the shelter's regular residents. "But they make me sad." "Why?" Jasmine asked. "Because they look like memories of home, and home is the hardest thing to lose." That night, Jasmine couldn't sleep. The shelter's narrow cot felt both familiar and strange after the luxury of Robert's guest room. She thought about his offer, the art exhibition, the chance to tell her story. But fear gnawed at her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she embarrassed him? What if? Her thoughts were interrupted by raised voices outside. Two women were arguing over a missing blanket. The shelter staff intervened quickly, but the incident reminded Jasmine of something she'd been trying to forget: the precariousness of her existence. In his penthouse, Robert sat with his therapist, Dr. Chun, whom he hadn't seen in years. "Why now?" Dr. Chun asked. "After all this time, why seek therapy again?" "Because I don't know how to help someone who doesn't want to be helped," Robert admitted. "Because I found my sister, but I might lose her again because I don't know how to bridge the gap between our worlds." "Perhaps," Dr. Chin suggested, "she doesn't need you to bridge the gap. Perhaps she needs you to understand why the gap exists in the first place." Robert thought about the art in Jasmine's notebook, the raw humanity she captured, the dignity she gave to those society ignored. "I've been trying to fix her life," he realized. "But maybe she's been trying to show me what life really is." That evening, he visited the community center where Jasmine had mentioned taking art classes. The building was run down, the art program long defunct due to budget cuts. But the walls still displayed student artwork, faded but powerful. The center's director recognized him. "Mr. Matthews, what brings you here?" Robert looked at the empty art room, the dried-up paint tubes, the broken easels. "I'd like to make a donation," he said. "But first, I need to understand what this place means to the community." As he learned about the center's history, its struggles, and its importance to people like Jasmine, Robert began to see what he'd been missing. It wasn't about swooping in with money and solutions. It was about supporting existing communities, understanding their needs, and respecting their autonomy. Back in his apartment, he looked at the empty guest room where Jasmine had stayed. On the desk, she'd left a single sketch, a self-portrait showing her as both the street artist she was and the little girl she'd been, connected by a thread of resilience that no amount of tragedy could break. After 2 weeks of Jasmine's absence, Robert found himself walking the streets where she used to stay, carrying her sketchbook that she'd left behind. The community center's art room was now undergoing renovation, funded anonymously through his foundation. He found her not on the street, but inside a small coffee shop where she'd gotten a part-time job. She was wiping tables, her M.O. Vehement's precise and dignified. "Your art program starts next week," he said without preamble. "The community center's looking for teachers." Jasmine paused, cloth still in hand. "I saw the renovations. Knew it had to be you." "I didn't do it for you," Robert said. "I did it because you helped me see what needed to be done." She gestured to the chair across from her. Robert sat, placing her sketchbook on the table between them. "I'm sorry," they both said simultaneously. "I pushed too hard," Robert continued. "I ran away," Jasmine countered, finally sitting down. It's what I've always done. When things get real, get complicated, it's safer to disappear, Robert finished. I understand that now. The coffee shop manager appeared, frowning at the interaction, but Jasmine held up her hand. Taking my break, Marie. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Robert spoke again. I've been seeing a therapist, trying to understand why I thought I could fix everything with money. And I realized I've been trying to make up for not protecting you when we were kids. But I was just a child too. Jasmine's eyes softened. We both were. She opened her sketchbook, turning to a new drawing she'd made. The red door of their childhood home, but this time with two small figures holding hands in front of it. I've been remembering more, she said quietly. Not just fragments anymore. Real memories. You used to smuggle me cookies after dinner. Robert laughed softly. Mom would get so mad, but you never told on me. We protected each other then. We can protect each other now, Robert said, but differently, as equals. Jasmine traced the outline of the door in her drawing. I want to see her. Our mother. Robert tensed. She's not well. The last time I mentioned you, I need to know, Robert. About what happened. About why she's so afraid. We both do. He nodded slowly. She has good days and bad days. We'll need to be careful. When? Tomorrow? I'll pick you up after your shift. As they made plans, Robert noticed how Jasmine had changed in the past 2 weeks. There was a new steadiness to her, a confidence that came from making her own way. The apartment offer still stands, he said. But on your terms. Come and go as you please. No expectations. Jasmine considered this. I'd like to keep working here and teaching at the center, if they'll have me. Of course. And I'm not attending any more dinner parties with your friends. They're not my friends anymore, Robert said simply. Real friends don't need to be taught basic human dignity. As Jasmine returned to work, Robert watched her interact with customers. Some kind, some rude, all receiving the same level of professional courtesy. She learned to navigate both worlds, he realized, while he was still learning to step out of his. That evening, he made several calls to the nursing home, to his lawyer, and finally to a private investigator he trusted. If they were going to confront their past, they needed to be prepared for whatever uncomfortable truths might emerge. In his office, he opened a secure folder on his computer. The investigator had already uncovered disturbing connections between their father's old business partners and the timing of Jasmine's disappearance. Tomorrow, those pieces of the puzzle might finally come together. As he stared at the red door in Jasmine's drawing, Robert felt both dread and determination. Whatever they discovered at the nursing home, they would face it together, not as savior and saved, but as brother and sister, equals in their quest for truth. The nursing home's fluorescent lights cast unflattering shadows as Robert and Jasmine walked down the corridor. Their footsteps echoed on the linoleum floors, matching the nervous rhythm of their hearts. She might not recognize you, Robert warned quietly. And if she does, I know, Jasmine replied, squeezing his arm. I'm ready. Eleanor Matthews sat in her usual spot by the window, a photo album open on her lap. She looked up as they entered, her eyes focusing first on Robert, then sliding to Jasmine. The change was immediate. Her face drained of color, the photo album slipping from her trembling hands. No, she whispered. No, they promised. They said if I kept quiet. Mom, Robert said gently, it's okay. We're both here now. We're safe. Jasmine stepped forward slowly, kneeling beside Eleanor's chair. The house had a red door, she said softly. You used to grow roses in the backyard. Eleanor's hand reached out, hovering inches from Jasmine's face. My baby girl, my Jasmine. Tears began flowing down her cheeks. I tried to protect you. I tried so hard. Protect us from what, Mom? Robert pressed, pulling up chairs for himself and Jasmine. From whom? Eleanor's hands clutched at her cardigan. Your father. He wasn't what everyone thought. The company, there were things happening. Terrible things. Money laundering, fraud. I found documents. She paused. Her breathing labored. A nurse glanced in, but Robert waved her away. I threatened to expose everything, Eleanor continued. That's when they took you, Jasmine. To keep me quiet. They said They said they would hurt Robert next if I ever told anyone. Who took me? Jasmine asked, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. Eleanor reached for a bedside table, pulling out an old leather-bound diary. I wrote it all down. Every name, every detail. I knew someday you'd come back. That someday it would be safe. Robert took the diary, opening it carefully. The pages were filled with his mother's elegant handwriting, documenting dates, conversations, suspicions. But it was a name that caught his eye, James Porter. Porter, he said incredulously. The same James Porter who just contacted me about the global tech investment? Eleanor nodded grimly. He was your father's right hand. He organized everything, the kidnapping, the threats. He's been watching you, Robert, all these years, making sure I kept my silence. Jasmine stood abruptly, walking to the window. I remember him, she said. A man with a silver watch. He used to visit the house. The day I disappeared, he offered me candy. Robert's mind raced, connecting dots. The recent investment offer, Porter's insistence on meeting in person, his unusual interest in Robert's personal life. He's still controlling things, Robert realized. Still trying to protect their secrets. There's more, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She turned pages in her diary frantically until she found what she was looking for. Your father. He didn't die in that car accident. It was staged. He's been living in Europe, managing everything from there. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Robert sat heavily in his chair, while Jasmine pressed her forehead against the cool window glass. All these years, she said quietly, I thought I was alone, unwanted, but I was just a pawn in their game. Eleanor reached for both their hands, pulling them close. I wanted to look for you every day. The not knowing, it nearly destroyed me. But I had to protect Robert. I had to keep one of my children safe. You did what you had to do, Jasmine said, surprising both Robert and Eleanor with her forgiveness. But now we need to do what's right. Robert opened his phone, ready to call his lawyers, but Jasmine stopped him. Not yet, she said. We need to be smart about this. These men, they've managed to hide their crimes for decades. We need to be strategic. Eleanor gripped their hands tighter. Be careful, she pleaded. They're still powerful, still dangerous. We will be, Robert promised. But they're going to pay for what they did to our family. As they left the nursing home, carrying Eleanor's diary, Robert and Jasmine shared a look of determination. The truth had finally emerged, but with it came new dangers and difficult decisions. The past wasn't Feeney, shed with them yet. Back in Robert's penthouse, they spread the diary pages across his dining table. Eleanor's meticulous notes revealed a complex web of corporate fraud, blackmail, and violence spanning decades. James Porter's name appeared repeatedly, along with details of offshore accounts and shell companies. Look at this. Jasmine pointed to an entry dated just after her kidnapping. She tracked Porter's movements for months. Bank transfers, private flights, even his meetings with Dad in Switzerland. Robert loosened his tie, studying the documents. We need to be careful how we handle this. Porter's global tech deal, it's not just an investment. It's a trap. He's trying to pull me into their web. Or trying to keep you close, Jasmine suggested, making sure you don't ask the wrong questions. They worked through the night, piecing together the puzzle. By morning, both were exhausted but determined. Jasmine had filled several pages of her sketchbook with timelines and connections, her artist's eye finding patterns in the chaos. The charity event, she said suddenly. We should move forward with it. Robert looked up, surprised. Are you sure? With everything that's happening, it's perfect cover. They'll expect you to cancel it, to focus on their deal. Instead, we'll be publicly visible, making it harder for them to move against us. Over the next few days, they balanced their investigation with preparations for the event. Jasmine threw herself into creating new pieces, her art now infused with a deeper understanding of her past. Each painting told a story of loss, resilience, and redemption. Robert noticed how she worked with fierce intensity, channeling her pain and anger into her art. One piece particularly struck him, a diptych showing two paths diverging from a red door, one leading to darkness, the other to light. That's us, she explained, not looking up from her canvas. The paths we were forced to take. But look, she pointed to where the paths began to curve back toward each other. We found our way back. Meanwhile, Robert maintained his normal business routine, carefully deflecting Porter's increasingly insistent calls about the global tech deal. Each time Porter mentioned meeting in person, Robert thought of his mother's trembling hands and Jasmine's stolen childhood. One afternoon, as Jasmine was setting up her exhibition space at the community center, a custodian approached her. "There's someone watching the building," he said quietly. "Been there all morning. Black car, tinted windows." Jasmine texted Robert immediately. Within minutes, his security team confirmed it was one of Porter's men. "They're getting nervous," Robert said over the phone. "Good. Let them see us preparing for the event. Let them wonder what we know." The day before the exhibition, their mother had a moment of clarity. She insisted on contributing something to Jasmine's show, a preserved rose from her old garden, pressed between glass frames. "I saved it," she told Jasmine, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "From the last roses you helped me plant." Before, Jasmine hung the pressed rose alongside her paintings, a tangible link between past and present. That evening, as they finalized the exhibition layout, Robert received an unexpected email, an invitation from Porter to discuss the global tech deal at the charity event itself. "He's getting bold," Jasmine observed, reading over his shoulder. "Or desperate. Both, probably." Robert drafted a careful reply, accepting the meeting. "We'll need to be ready." They stayed up late, finalizing their plan. The exhibition would serve multiple purposes, not just showcasing Jasmine's art and raising awareness for homeless initiatives, but also forcing their father's old associates into the open. "Are you afraid?" Jasmine asked as they sat on Robert's balcony, watching the city lights. "Of Porter? No. Of losing you again? Yes." She squeezed his hand. "Not gonna happen. We're not powerless children anymore." The night before the event, Jasmine finally moved back into Robert's guest room. As she unpacked her few belongings, she found the old photograph that had started everything. Two children on a porch swing, unaware of the storms ahead. "We're going to finish this," she said to herself, placing the photo beside her bed. "For those children. For Mom. For all of us." Robert, in his study, made one final call to his legal team, ensuring everything was in place. Tomorrow would change everything. For their family, for Porter's empire, for the truth they'd buried so long ago. As the city slept, brother and sister prepared for a confrontation decades in the making, each finding strength in the other's presence, each ready to face whatever came next. The exhibition space buzzed with anticipation. Jasmine's artwork lined the walls, stark, beautiful pieces that told stories of struggle and triumph. The community center's renovated gallery had been transformed, mixing the raw authenticity of street art with professional presentation. Robert adjusted his tie, scanning the growing crowd. Media personnel mingled with local artists and community members. His security team, carefully disguised as event staff, maintained discreet positions throughout the space. "He's here," Jasmine whispered, nodding toward the entrance where James Porter had just arrived, his silver watch catching the light. He looked older than in Robert's memories, but his eyes held the same calculating coldness. "Mr. Matthews," Porter called out, approaching with practiced confidence. "Quite a departure from your usual investment ventures." "Sometimes change is necessary," Robert replied, watching Porter's reaction carefully. "Have you met the artist?" "My sister." "Yes, ma'am." Porter's smile flickered for just a moment. "Sister? I wasn't aware you had a—" "Yes, you were," Jasmine interrupted, her voice steady. "You knew exactly who I was. The little girl you offered candy to 20 years ago." The color drained from Porter's face. Behind him, Eleanor Matthews was being wheeled in by a nurse, her presence carefully timed. She clutched her old diary in her lap. "What is this?" Porter hissed, keeping his voice low despite his obvious agitation. "Justice," Robert said simply. "Federal agents are here, Mr. Porter." Mixed in with the crowd. "They're very interested in what's in our mother's diary. About the fraud, the kidnapping, about father's fake death." "You're bluffing," Porter sneered, but his eyes darted toward the exits. "Am I?" Robert gestured to Jasmine's central piece, a massive canvas depicting a corporate boardroom filled with shadows, a small child's red shoe visible beneath the table. Art has a way of revealing truth. Porter reached into his jacket, but Robert's security team was faster. Within seconds, they had him surrounded, discreet but unmistakably present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert addressed the crowd, tapping a glass for attention. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight isn't just about art or charity. It's about truth, about family." The crowd gathered closer as Robert continued. 20 years ago, this city lost something precious. Not just an innocent child, but its soul. Tonight, we begin to make that right. Federal agents emerged from the crowd, their badges glinting. Porter, realizing he was trapped, made one last desperate move. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "Your father is already in custody," Jasmine cut in. "Swiss authorities picked him up an hour ago. Did you really think we'd make our move before ensuring he couldn't run again?" As Porter was led away, Eleanor wheeled herself forward. "It's over," she said softly. "Finally over." The event transformed into something more than just an art exhibition. It became a symbol of reconciliation, of justice, of healing. Jasmine's artwork spoke to everyone present. The wealthy donors saw past their prejudices. The community members felt their stories validate. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed, Robert and Jasmine sat alone in the gallery, surrounded by her art. "What now?" she asked. "Now we rebuild," Robert replied. "Not just our family, but everything Porter and his network destroyed. The foundation will focus on supporting families separated by violence and poverty. And the company will be restructured. Ethical investment, community development. Your voice on the board will help ensure that." Jasmine smiled, touching the frame of her first painting, the one of the red door. "You know, for years I thought finding my family would fix everything. But it wasn't about finding family. It was about finding ourselves," Robert finished. They sat in comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows. The pressed rose from their mother's garden caught the light, its dried petals holding memories of a past now reclaimed. "We should visit Mom tomorrow," Jasmine suggested. "Help her plant new roses." Robert nodded, thinking of how far they'd come, from strangers on a street to siblings united in purpose. The journey had changed them both, breaking down walls of privilege and prejudice, building bridges of understanding and love. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break over New York City. A new day, a new beginning. The red door of their past had finally closed, but the future stood wide open, full of possibilities they would face together. "Together," Jasmine said, as if reading his thoughts. "No matter what comes next." "Together," Robert agreed. Their shared strength a testament to the power of family, truth, and the unbreakable bonds that survive even the darkest nights. The end.